Excellent. All right, I'm very excited for this topic, and great to have everyone on here, and excited too, and with great attitude and so forth. I'll go to the slides here. The chat, as always, is in our MeWe group. Nice, yeah. Fletch had brought up about the Terry Goodkind series, which is first rule, very fun to read. And then he wrote another series recently, with kind of a spin-off. Let's see here. Okay, so let's get on the right slide. All right. I'm also excited about this series in general. I'm thinking that I'm going to probably, I mentioned this before, but it's kind of coalesced for me a little bit about how I'll do it. I'll probably do this series mostly by recordings, and then live. I'm planning on having Dave Mazzaros as another part of the Heroes series in 2 weeks from now, our next webinar, and then I'll probably do some sort of discussion. It's possible that I'll continue this in the month on the live webinar, but in general, I think I'll go for the recording. For example, what happened to me this time was I had this webinar kind of come together for the second webinar in my mind, but then I was hesitant to record it because I knew I was going to be teaching something, in the live webinar, and so I didn't want to risk not having something particularly good for the live webinar. So I don't want to keep running into that. So I'll for the short term at least, I'll do things that way. All right. So the definitive series, I'm excited about it. It's coming together as I'm hoping. I know it's only the beginning of the second one, but still, the organizing principle of I started to say breakthroughs, but bottlenecks from that we started with, then leads logically into this next organizing principle, and there won't necessarily be more organizing principles, but this idea of foundationalism, and it's what makes LOI LOI. It's what makes it unique and necessary. Yeah, so I want to do it justice. Interestingly enough, I realized right before this webinar that that I could even re-record this if for some reason I don't feel like I nailed it, live for posterity. So if you're hearing this, then I guess I did, and if you're not, then you're not, and you're hearing some presumably better version in the future. All right. So I started to allude to this last webinar, and the other thing about foundationalism is that if you get this, then you get LOI, law of implication, in a certain way. You've gotten the main paradigm shift, and in a certain way, you've already won as you make that paradigm shift. And the rest ends up kind of just being details that keep making your life better in various ways, all the other things that I can show you that I've discovered and such. So I keep thinking of Stephen Covey's book. I mentioned it on the next slide, just as one of my little things here, like in terms of meta strategy. So meta strategy, and I was reminded of this, Matt Lights, one of the great speakers at the event that our business had just this weekend. A lot of the people live right now were on that, and we're mentioning about enjoying it. But he texted me, and he said that he used a quote from me as kind of an important kind of cornerstone, or maybe a way to start. I'd have to relook at the text, but it had to do with going into the context, right, that I talk about, because that's kind of the first mistake people make with strategy, is our minds are kind of drawn to the center, to the Mike calls it like the glory hound, the thing that kind of stands out in the environment, or the it manifests itself in all kinds of ways that our mind kind of goes to the center. Often people will feel like a problem is solved if they can just identify the enemy that's responsible for the problem, right? Or blame somebody. It doesn't have to be an enemy necessarily, but either the enemy or the culprit. Or one idea, or they'll say, oh, well, that person did that because they're smart, or I messed that up because I was stupid, or that person messed it up because they're stupid, or they did that because they're a jerk, right? So it kind of boils it down to one kind of simple thing to blame, either a concept or a label or whatever. And then with meta strategy, you're looking more in context, right? Sun Tzu's Art of War, a lot of contextual stuff, right? And so on and so forth. And The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People by Stephen Covey, which is a brilliant book, and a great bit of kind of success philosophy. And it was helpful for me to read. I've read it multiple times, like in my 20s, which was over 20 years ago. I'm 48 now. But when I think of this idea, when I think about meta strategy leading into foundationalism, and also how people constantly stop short of getting to foundationalism in practice, and it's the example that where he stopped short is kind of a famous, at least in my head, famous example. Not famous like people know that he stopped short, but in my mind he did. And so I don't know if famous is the right word, but he's famous. And I know that he stopped short. But one of his chapters is called Begin with the End in Mind. And he talks about how if you, like, one way to approach life would be to think about what you want people to say at your funeral, and kind of go from there. And I don't mean to overly caricature what he's saying, and so forth. But there's a certain kind of shocking nature to that to me, where if you really stop and that'll basically help most anybody relative to what they're already doing, right? And he goes on to say, for example, you might not feel like either on your deathbed or when someone's praising you, like that spending more time in the office or overtime or too much time, right, is what you wished you had done, right? And I've mentioned how even that isn't necessarily correct, right? It just kind of came out of me at some point. But that example kind of easily comes to my mind. But if we think about that approach, again, it could help a lot of people relative to what they might have otherwise thought or done, right? And kind of jog them out of their give them another perspective, which when you have another perspective, it's like visiting another country. That country's culture doesn't have to be perfect. It can even possibly be worse in various ways than your own culture or whatever. But it still helps you kind of see things from different perspectives, and then allows you to better step back from both countries' cultures in a certain sense, right? But that guiding principle, or trying to then think about what you'd want people to say at your funeral, I don't know how well I'm articulating why that doesn't really, we don't want to stop there, right? That it's not that he says and stop there, but there's a way that he kind of, because I'm so used to seeing people stop short in various ways, there's a way that he stopped short of things. Now, I don't think he himself, this is a total wild guess, but there's a certain way that I would guess that he's probably Christian, and so he likely believes that there's more to things, from that angle, for starters. But he's trying to write a book for people, that doesn't get into that. That's one thing. But still, right. I alluded to the correct answer, right? Is the real thing we want to, if we're going to begin with the end in mind, then the end goal is that everyone in existence that we could possibly touch or communicate with, and however that might work. And I use the word existence because as we think things through, get to the bottom of things, then it doesn't really make sense that this world would be the end of it, right? we can get to where we understand the basic nature of God's existence, and that and the basic nature of God. And then when we couple that with the way this world works, and the fact that even like children die, at 1 minute old, right, or 1 day old and 1 year old and so forth, then it neither makes sense that that this world would be it, but nor does it make sense the various conclusions that humans come to don't make a lot of sense either, right? Including what I think a lot of Christians as people, I'm not referring to Jesus here, but just people interpreting both, not just Jesus, but Christians tend to add a lot of other people that they in essence treat as God, right? When they treat the Bible as written by God, and then therefore all the authors are treated as if they're God, at least while they were writing whatever they wrote for the Bible. And so, but the view they come to about what's going to happen after death doesn't really jive with various other foundational truths that we can separately figure out. So foundationalism, in one hand, it'll make sense, but on another hand, it's so counterintuitive because our brains run an algorithm that fabricates a kind of certainty and a sense that there's a reason for what we think and feel and the certainty that we have. And the thing about foundationalism is that there could be a reason why you feel like something's true. Like if you ask someone of a particular political persuasion, well, why is this correct? And they could say, well, because of this, right? Because, well, don't you want to be a patriot? Or there's a consensus of scientists that say it, every real scientist agrees on such and such, right? So they'll cite that as a reason, but if you start to track the reason beneath the reason and then keep going, you hit something where you hit kind of an abyss. And one exciting practical application of what I'm beginning to talk about here is that in the second statement, I didn't do the first statement justice yet, but in the second statement, I wrote, foundationalism is the only sure way out of the mind trap we find ourselves. We often find ourselves in, I should have said, or are in without realizing. Either we find ourselves in it or we're in it and don't find that we're in it, but we're in it. And what I mean by that is, in a zillion ways, there's times that we either realize we don't like the pattern that our mind is in or how our mind is making us feel about something, or we're just flat out scared of how our mind is going to make us feel about such and such a thing, right? When you dread or worry about an event that you think might come up, or a consequence of something, or some result, or just something that might come up in the future, then if you stop and think about it, you're really dreading, in most every case, or maybe every case, it comes down to how your own mind is going to make you feel about it, right? Like if you're dreading that a person will react in a certain way, or you won't get a particular job or promotion or account, or won't have enough money, and you might have to, beg people for something, then, and it's in a sense justified, right? We don't have like full control over our mind, where we really are going to feel a certain type of pain about certain things. But as we come to realize how much we're kind of worried about how our own mind is going to make us feel about certain things, or if just keep us up, and not let us sleep, or whatever, then we can't necessarily make our mind do a particular thing, like make us feel good about a certain type of thing or whatever, directly. That can happen over time. But what we can do is loosen a certain type of hold it has, where we feel like it should make us feel that way, like it's inevitable, or there's a certain sense of the meaning of the word should that we once again, without always realizing it, we were a prisoner of constantly. Like if we're afraid of people judging us in a certain way, then if we stop and realize that we're only typically afraid of a certain class, I don't mean like an economic class, but like a certain group of people that we feel like is our peer group, right? I see this kind of in a simple way with my wife who grew up in Russia until she was 27, then she came here. So there's a certain intuitive feeling like she fully feels like, you know, America's her country, yada, yada now in a way. But there's a way that the judgments of people that are Russian mean more to her in most cases, right, than people who aren't, in kind of a pretty significant difference, just sort of intuitively, right? And same way that we all are, but it's an easy way to see it, right? We're all this way in various ways, where we have a certain peer group in our mind, and if there's someone that's pretty far outside of that, then we just don't, like, their judgments don't mean the same to us typically, right? So, but when we if we think about what that logically must mean, then sorry, my thoughts jump tracks there for a second. Our peer group, judgments, foundational, our mind trap. So we can be very worried sometimes about what other people will think of us. And this is very real. Like we can claim sometimes that we're not, or tell ourselves that we're not, but we certainly all will feel this way. Like there's plenty of, you know, somewhat extreme, at least, just to test yourself, right? For me, and this is true for me too, where I have a sense, I'm explaining how to kind of get out of it in a certain way, but there's still an obvious reality too. If we really act in a certain way, like if I ran outside naked and people were like judging me, you know, that I would feel like silly, right? Very silly. I would feel like there's a reason why people should judge me, right? And this is the only example I could think of on the spur of the moment. Sorry, but what the reason the point of all these little examples I'm feeling for is that there's an aspect of feeling like they should judge us for that. Like it makes a certain type of sense. And then there's other times when we judge ourselves, we're like, oh, that was so dumb, and we feel like a certain sort of emotional pain from that, and we might be afraid of feeling like that in the future, where we judge ourselves. And there's an important component for that. I'm trying to build a little scenario and isolate and point out for you within that, is this feeling like there's a component where it should be that way, and that's that component of how that it makes sense that there's a certain type of judgment going on, for example, is one example of a mind trap, that we can remove that should component in many cases. Sometimes things are legitimately wrong, and therefore that it isn't that we're going to feel like we should do wrong things. But then there's plenty of things that aren't really legitimately wrong. With our family, for example, right? There might be things that our mom expects us to do, or visit on Thanksgiving or something, right? And they might really kind of pressure you for that. Or people could have a certain sexual orientation, and at least historically or now or whatever, members of their family could feel disappointed in that, or like it's suboptimal. Or if we don't go to college, right? There could be, that's a good example, right? There could be a sense of feeling judged. And like for me and how I grew up, if I didn't go to college, I would have felt like I was wrong, kind of like morally wrong, or like lesser, and plenty of people, and I would have felt like justifiably I no longer feel this way. Of course, I'm not saying that we should feel this way about ourselves or others that don't go to college, for goodness sakes. But it was very real feeling realistically, right? And that's a significant, there's plenty of subcultures where this is very true, right? Where not going to college is, there's almost like a morally negative component to it, right? So this ended up being a great example. So we can kind of look at it. It's a great example of a mind trap that I'm talking about. But these come up all over the place, and these come up with a lot of us feel like if we don't accomplish enough in any particular day on any given day, we feel a certain feeling that we don't like about ourselves, and we might also feel overwhelmed, right, and so forth. So for the future and all that stuff. So that's another example. But sticking with the college one, part of the issue, if someone is in that situation where, let's say they decide they don't want to go to college, but they're in a subculture with their family and peers, the group they feel is a peer group, where they feel justifiably judged, or like they don't want to tell people, they're kind of ashamed of it. Like they might even feel like okay with their own decision, like privately it's good, but then they might feel even mixed feelings about it for themselves. Right now I would have, and they would feel like other people might judge them, and they might be afraid of that judgment where they might not want to tell people. And if you're afraid of a judgment, it's because there's a certain component of it that you feel like is real, even if you sort of disagree with it and don't feel like rebellious against that judgment, if there's a negative feeling from it. Because we can tell that because there's times when someone might judge us for something where we don't feel any problem whatsoever because we fully feel like they're wrong. We might see this with politics, right? Where there might be certain political beliefs that some other person might have that we feel like is a totally different peer group. And we almost might even take pride in that person judging us or not liking our political views, right? So that would be a counter, like an alternative or an example by by kind of a counter example. So this sort of thing where we spot something we're afraid of or a judgment or whatever, and as we look for this, there's a bazillion examples. It's kind of a day-to-day occurrence, and what's a daily occurrence is kind of making decisions and shaping our lives and having our goals shaped by these things sort of looming around all around us, right? These sort of norms and standards and ways that we'd be judged, and ways that we might feel pride if we do the thing, if we get into and attend the right college, right? People that go to Harvard, they find a way to insert that in the conversation, as frequently as possible, right? Um, and I mean, my day after day was shaped for me for much of my childhood, right? Based around getting into a good college, right? It was literally daily. I would spend most of my day all based around that one idea, if you think about it, right? In practice, right? Life just kind of revolved around school in a certain way. It's 5 days a week plus homework, right? And just et cetera, et cetera. Even weekends were kind of defined by the fact there wasn't school. And then again, there's of course like work and studying and so forth. And you likely have things like this. And to break out, there's times that we want to break out. We spot these sort of traps in a certain sense, but they're coupled with this feeling like you should maybe think that way. I've run into people that are gay and let's say they were raised Catholic, and they were, and I certainly don't think they should feel this way, but it's utterly understandable at the same time, right? They feel like there's maybe something there's like a guilt combined with they totally embrace, okay, look, I'm homosexual, I was born this way, this is how it is, and but then they at the same time, they've absorbed this other ideas that maybe it's kind of, there's something fundamentally wrong, right? And if for anyone new, I zero wrong, of course, in my understanding, right? So, but it's an interesting example because I've seen the suffering from it, and I've also tell people that I've made a difference for them in when we get foundational, it can help resolve that. There was a good example that Faith has shared, right? One of you guys, she might be on the webinar, I won't check, but with like being victimized like sexually, right? And then how women can feel a certain sense of okay, that was wrong, but and I get that for about the other person, right? The person who victimized them. But there's some lingering sense of maybe there's something that I did, right? Or now strategically with any of us, if we're victimized, maybe there's some tactic, or at least we could have done to not get victimized in some way, right? Like if someone gets some malware on your computer, maybe there was some tactic that you quote unquote should have been aware of, or some app that you should have had, right? But that really has nothing to do with understanding that whoever victimized you in a way like that, where they violated you or your property, they were obviously fully wrong, and you don't bear any responsibility. There's no moral component to tactically getting something wrong, right? Like you don't play any moral responsibility or any of that type of responsibility, right? There's nothing that you should have done differently when we're using the word should to imply a certain type of moral thing. We don't use the word moral all the time, but we use the word should in a way that logically necessitates a moral component. You see the difference, right? Because if it was just like a tactical thing that we weren't aware of, or that we just didn't get right in terms of drinking a second drink, and a tactic of not doing so might have also let us escape the sexual assault, right? But there's no moral component to that. There's nothing immoral about drinking a second drink, right? We even talk about stupidity sometimes in a way that implies there's a morality to being like, getting again like a tactic wrong, like, well, that was stupid, right? If someone says like well, you shouldn't have had that second drink, right? Well, there's the trouble is there's the bullery and conflicting meanings of the word should, and I'm harping on this because the word should is radically important to our day-to-day like success. It and the different concepts and teasing apart the different concepts that the word should refers to, again, is radically important. It's very immensely practically important. Kind of very close to it. It's in the mix of the foundational ideas that as we get in life, it gives us a tool that's constantly relevant. And so the idea that someone shouldn't have had a second drink, tactically we need a word to be able to say you shouldn't have done that, so to speak, right? If we're talking about what tactic might be more effective for a certain outcome. But there's no moral component to the should. You shouldn't have had a second drink, if that makes sense. And it's the moral component that causes us a certain emotional turmoil. It has a different ripple effect on a lot. And the moral effect, which also relates to norms and standards and so fundamental to how our brain works and makes goals. So your future goals are a ripple effect, weirdly enough, of your morality, because morality is intricately tied in or inextricably tied into a sense of norms and standards and your goals. So that, again, that's why I talk about morality when I'm talking about goals and success, whereas normally people don't talk specifically about morality in a very clear way. But it can't be decoupled. Like in other words, understanding-wise, we need to understand morality in order to not be trapped by a fake morality. See, again, our brain creates a fake certainty nonstop. We're literally surrounded. I don't know if literal or figurative, or somewhere between literally and figuratively, surrounded by fake certainty. Like our whole world, in essence, our whole mental world and psyche and belief system, until and unless I help you break through, or maybe I have for a lot of people to some significant degree, or if you do it all yourself, you bootstrap yourself. But it took me a lot to do it, a lot of, thousands of hours in a certain sense. So it presumably take a concerted effort for anyone on their own. But however it happens, kind of interrupted my own train of thought there for a moment. I was saying, yeah, we're surrounded by our whole world is sort of based on a sort of fake certainty, and so we're kind of trapped by it everywhere we look. Whenever when someone wants to feel a different way about a goal, when people go after a goal but they seem to constantly wonder, it seems like they're sabotaging in some way, or like driving with one foot on the gas, one foot on the brake, or getting distracted, all those things, it weirdly relates to a moral component, because that's logically coupled with how our mind creates goals and our norms and standards. And this sort of fake certainty and the sense of should, right? Like our goals are tied to this idea, well, we should accomplish them. And again, we even see that often for people, might be at night or something, when they feel like whether they kind of often do a mental check whether they accomplished enough that day, and there'll be a certain moral component to that. We want to be able to spot from now on, ideally, right? Or maybe either you already have it, or from now on, spot this moral component that's constantly part of your thinking and feeling. Whenever you feel like, well, maybe I should have done more, or I should have done more today, or if you feel self-satisfied that you did enough today, right? And the other thing that messes us up in terms of productivity and efficiency and effectiveness, when that's relevant, right? You don't always have to be full efficiency and effectiveness in life in a certain sense. Or at least you don't need to maximize at least the same thing. For example, you might not need to be fully efficient with how much you make money constantly, right? You may, but you may not. But to the extent that you want to be, which is plenty, then a huge source of inefficiency is a feeling of self-satisfaction, like we accomplished enough today. And so is the answer to be dissatisfied? Plenty of self-improvement gurus or would-be gurus say, well, you want to be dissatisfied in a certain way, if you know what, if they'll be saying, like, if you know what I mean, or something like that. Or they'll kind of preach a certain type of dissatisfaction as the answer. But that's only the answer while you're caught in the trap. The answer is to get out of that, just to realize it's a trap, right? If you can't win either way, that's how you can tell there's a trap, right? If you're either going to be dissatisfied or satisfied, and you only win on a certain day if you feel satisfied right at the end, kind of right at the end of what, practically speaking, could be your most effective work amount, right? If you while you're in the trap, then if you achieve a sense of satisfaction too early in the day, then you kind of just stop working. And that might be suboptimal depending on your situation for a number of reasons, right? But you do that, right? We all do that. It's part of my design and planning when I'm on any level that I'm doing business. is designed around that fact of people feeling self-satisfied too early. For example, you want someone that you're working with to finish a certain project. Then I'm very careful not to give them other stuff, not because they're busy, ironically, not because it'll take their time, but because the worst thing is it can give them a sense of satisfaction from doing it. And that satisfaction might be self-satisfaction, but there's a different type of satisfaction, right, that's related in business, where we're satisfied that we feel like we've justified our work that we're supposed to do kind of for others, right? So if I really want someone to get one thing done, then if I give them something else, which is wildly common to give people other things, by the way. It might sound like obvious not to get them other stuff, but it's like really, really easy to be like, oh, but could you do this or could you do that too? We don't even say too. You just want something and they're the one that might be able to do it, and so you just ask them, right? But what I keep in mind is this huge deal of, again, the person doesn't just have a self-satisfaction, they have another little norm and standard in their mind, right? Where it's like, okay, did I do enough for the business I'm in, the partnership I'm in, this particular person, my boss, whoever, right? And it might not, this doesn't only extend to business situations. Of course, the same type of thinking can extend to non-business situations, where if there's something important that you want from someone, right? Then, obviously, if you want something particular from your relationship partner, to go to an event with you, to have sex with you, to whatever with you, listen to some story you want to tell them or whatever, then you don't want to give them a different way to feel that sense. We in a relationship, we have whatever type of relationship, right? We realistically, if you look at it, right, we have a sense of like, okay, I did enough for this person today. Now, out of love, you might be happy to do more if they really need it, but we still have that meter, right? And whereas that meter isn't like all powerful, but it's pretty major. And I get a lot in life out of paying a lot of attention and be kind of religious, so to speak, about not giving people, that sense of satisfaction of, satisfying me in work or whatever, or the business, or their feeling of work with something that is not a priority, right? I'm always, I'm thinking in terms of priorities because it's the same type of thinking as thinking in terms of bottlenecks and what's the main bottleneck and so forth. Right, if there's strategy, right? If there's limited resources, then of course you need to prioritize those, which is why we then want to understand, have meta strategy, look in context. The more we understand, the better we can understand how to allocate those resources or how to guide or communicate with other people that influences how they allocate resources towards a mutual project or toward what you want and that sort of thing. Okay, so overall, I'm talking about mind traps because it's one of the terrific applications of foundationalism. Everything, all success, and therefore everything, is I started thinking about someone arguing and saying success is not everything, but of course success is everything. If you just look at success as obviously with whatever you're trying to do and whatever is good, you want to understand it and you want that to happen, and you have your goals and you want to achieve them, and you want the goals to be, you want to successfully pick the right goals in the first place, right? Successfully understand. So in the way that I'm talking about success, it's everything. Leads to everything good. I could say everything good. Right? Success is logically the same as successfully understanding and then getting to everything good for yourself or others. All right. Foundationalism is a critical organizing principle to achieve success. and a major application of foundationalism. So everything, back to everything, is an application of foundationalism. But these mind traps are a great thing to latch onto for the beginning. And to latch onto that, we want to see how pervasive they are. And I was giving the example of this mind trap of self-satisfaction or self-dissatisfaction, and how various gurus might talk about how we want to be dissatisfied, and that's will help incentivize us to keep going. If we're satisfied, then we'll sit on our butt. But whenever I spot that type of thing, where you need to kind of have something bad to get something good, or that sort of nature, then there's going to be something deeper to understand. There's a trap there when you kind of can't win, right? That's like a trap, right? That's like a rat on a wheel, or a hand, whatever, a rat race. And so we want to break out. And we're going to have a magic weapon, figuratively this time, not literally. We're going to have a magic weapon that will constantly allow us to break sort of a lock on the trap. And so we can't directly feel the way we want always. We can't necessarily feel like a certain task we have to do is euphoric, or that eating, broccoli and whatever else you're supposed to eat, God knows, right? That advice is, conflicting and so forth. But, is just pure delicious, and cinnamon rolls are not, I'm not saying that you can immediately feel that way. What we can do is an interesting thing, even with the cinnamon rolls. Suppose we feel like desserts should taste better than sprouted grains. Just eating sprouted grains straight up, with no anything on them, right? What's the word? No dressing or whatever. Straight up sprouted grains. That can taste nice, a little bit, but at some point, but there again, we're exploring the word should here together too, right? Do you see how we may have the sense that, well, it should be the case that dessert, or there's a basic thing. I don't have it written down, but I could try to make a slide, but I'll probably run into doesn't always work that well. Usually skips around. Yeah. It's okay. I'll just write this because I know these things are all related, so they sort of lay a sort of framework. I know it in a certain sense I'm skipping around a little bit, but I'm skipping around things that are all very related, so it sort of fills in a certain net, so to speak. Is with should. Another way that should is used, it's a little bit different than moral, and it's a little bit different than tactical, right? So a tactical use of the word should is like, all right, so you want to accomplish this goal. We're gonna presume that we'll stipulate to the fact that this goal is what you want to accomplish, and then you should do such and such. And that doesn't mean morally, right? It means like I'm not going to morally judge you if you don't do that tactic. I'm just saying that tactic, that action will be a useful, efficient, effective action to take, right? Like the example where I said not having the second or third drink or whatever number of drinks is relevant for a particular person might be a useful tactic if you say that you particularly want to avoid, you're in an environment where there's a risk of a sexual assault or a date rape or something, and then if someone stipulates to that, like they want to avoid that, right? That's their goal. I'm not telling them they should or shouldn't have that goal, morally or not. But if they say that they want to, then tactically there's some tactic so that's should, right? That and again, this is really important to tease apart these different meanings of the word should, because since they use the same word in speech, our mind can confuse and blur them together and start to switch between them by accident, where a tactical should can feel like a moral should and so forth. But then there's another should, and the other thing about shoulds is they contribute to our norms and standards that are invisible in our mind, And then our norms and standards is where our goals that our mind gives us and feels like we should have certain goals. That comes from an invisible layer of shoulds, which is our norms and standards. This is a bit of an overview still as I talk about things. For anybody new, I'm saying a bunch of things that I fleshed out in the past and explained, and I will in this series over time. So a third type of should that gets confused with other things is how things are. And so this desert thing can kind of help what we mean, where we could feel, you can feel a certain sense of like, well, it should be the case that, not morally, not tactically, but there's a certain meaning to the word should that we use normally, that we use in common speech, and we might not articulate it in this way, but we feel it, right? Like it makes sense, is another way to put it, that dessert, like a cinnamon roll, tastes better than Brussels sprouts, right? Or sprouted whatever sprouts. Right, like you can see this in a child, right? At some point, with at least some children, probably most, right? They have a sense that desserts are expected to taste better than vegetables, right? There could be exceptions to that, but I'm just trying to illustrate a usage of the word. So let's think of a child, which is pretty easy, right? That's not an exception to that. And they feel like if something's a vegetable, then it shouldn't taste very good, perhaps. And if something's a dessert, or at least a certain types of desserts, or desserts, their particular flavor that they like, it should taste good. But that usage of the word should is what happens is it has to do with kind of scientific expectations, right? Like the way that our mind sort of develops theories about the world and expects things. So now the word should means I expect it to be such and such. Like, in other words, this is how I think things are, right? Like it is the case that cinnamon rolls taste good, therefore they should taste good. Or not even a therefore, it's more like it's one and the same as. It's like each time I've had a cinnamon roll, it tastes good. So it is the case that cinnamon rolls taste good. When I've had vegetables, they don't taste as good. I'm not saying this, I'm speaking for the point of view of a person who just observes this in the world, right? So dessert keeps tasting good, or a certain type of dessert that I like. So it is that way, right? Something happens, we then expect it to happen, that expectation's met when it happens again and again. Now our mind feels like that is how the world is. But then at the exact same time that our mind decides that that is how the world is, it will often conclude the world also should be that way. And you can notice this in your own mind in various ways if you look for it, which can be hard to do while you're listening to me, but later you can make a note if you're thinking about it. Once you know to look for this, as I do, I see this all over the place where people's minds, and I see it in my own mind, where by kind of default, where they'll confuse is with should. And they'll say something like, oh, so you want me to fool myself into thinking that vegetables taste better than desserts, right? Or you want me to fool my mind into thinking that it wants to do this task, or do this homework, or doesn't want to, if someone's trying to drink less, let's say, doesn't want to drink. I'm trying to fool my mind. When we start concluding that we need to fool our mind, when that's one and the same with what we might otherwise call reprogramming the mind, or simply aligning, liking something, our mind giving us kind of a sense of enjoyment or good taste or whatever, nice feeling, pleasure or emotional good feeling out of a task that we have to do. Sorry, my mind's a little bit slow today based on just my sleep schedule kind of is random, and this webinar happened to fall when it's a little bit, my mind's not ideal. what I say will be right, but there'll be more pauses than if I was particularly sharp. Maybe a little more jumping around than is ideal. This is also organically. I'm talking about some things that are all part of explaining what I have on my slides, but it's kind of organically saying some things that I didn't have, like, as prepared comments, so to speak. So a little bit disorganized. All right. So let's just, I noted this is with should. I explained it. I don't mean with anything when I say explained it, I don't mean that now you fully got it, right? Or I explained it to perfection, but that I began to explain it. All right, let's reorient ourselves to the beginning here. So the first thing I wrote here is the logical result of meta strategy. Found it right. So it is not actually a sentence. I have a period on it, which I can erase. But foundation, in other words, I meant to say like foundationalism is the logical result of meta strategy, which is like contextual thinking, and frames, which is like perspectives, right? Another thing that is talked about in an interesting way in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's kind of a very useful book to read to kind of take you to a certain point and then also see where it kind of stops. And he talks about the lenses that we see the world and perspectives and things like that. It was reading that which was very interesting for me, that book, in my early 20s, and then also realizing as I read it that it was stopping too soon. It was like it opened my eyes to this idea of perspectives, or contributed to opening my eyes to this idea of perspectives. Him, Tony Robbins, things like that. But then I could tell they weren't going far enough. They would talk about like that we see the world through perspectives, but then what flowed logically from that was that we needed a way to not to think underneath perspectives. Like you reach an infinite regress if you're just looking in context, or you're just looking at trying to have a better frame or perspective, but then you need to use a lens to look at a lens, or a perspective to look at a perspective. Then nothing could really be true. It would just be perspective and perspective and perspective, unless you can hit something that's foundational, that isn't based on a perspective. And that the journey that began for me was transformative, right, and led to all of this. And it led to a place that people don't reach. Like when I reached it, I was able to understand things and do things kind of with my mind, and break out of traps that people just were not breaking out of. And it was clear they weren't, not from their behavior, but from their own ideas. Like there's no way, right? Their ideas kind of were mutually exclusive with what was correct. And it would be pervasive. It would be people I knew. It would be people that they're talking. It would be ideas that people act on, government, right? There's there's a kind of an overall cultural storyline with news and government and such that manifests itself in policies that are very real and affect people. And then in terms of success teaching and gurus and psychological teaching, in the kind of Tony Robbins vein and so forth. But they weren't able to do and realize what I could with certain concepts, or what he won the Nobel Prize for in like A Beautiful Mind, with Russell Crowe, where it dramatized that with Nash. I think I'm forgetting his first name. Was the guy, right? That sort of thing with game theory was obvious to me, and I basically figured it out independently. Had something to do with cooperation in game theory and so forth. All right, so I'm going to make sure I do this first line here justice. So when we look into context, we need to not stop until we reach bottom, so to speak. And instead, what people do is they reach a sense of like satisfaction. Like there's an overall algorithm that our mind runs where it is trying to create a sense of certainty for us. And it has no way to do that foundationally. Sorry, it has no way to merge certainty and actual truth on its own. It can't do it. And for the same type of reason that science can't answer ultimate questions, right? Science, you're observing out in the world, and the same thing our mind is doing, is it's getting bits of information, it's getting data, and it's trying to make sense of those. I was actually describing this to my wife recently as I was preparing for this webinar. And I used an explanation from, if we just think of visual information, will let go of all other types of information that's coming into our minds or that our mind is processing, and then both. And let's just isolate it down to visual just for the sake of understanding what I'm saying or kind of picturing it. Your mind, and to picture why our mind needs to do this and why it can't really do anything but this and the limits to it. So we want to appreciate our mind for what it does, see why it has to do things the way it does, and then realize the limits of it. And then that's going to allow us to interact consciously with our minds, which is a beautiful thing. It opens up a whole world of possibility and a whole world of breaking out of mind traps by eliminating the should component, especially the moral should component, which then opens us up to not outside of having to fool our minds. There's no such thing anymore. And now we just think what we want our minds to ideally feel or associate, with certain tasks, or what goals we want our mind to encode as important or associate with importance, things like that. And then that doesn't have to be instant. It typically is not going to be instantaneous. Sometimes it will be. But by removing the should component, you're removing a powerful and kind of only magnet in a certain way. Well, one other magnet, which is what we absorb from people's minds around us. But there's sort of a magnet for magnets, that we're removing the magnet for magnets. And so you remove the magnet for magnets, and then there's still magnets for feeling a certain way about things that we'd rather not, including a sense of importance. How we feel about importance kind of determines everything in our lives. Like what we feel about which goals are important and so forth, which resources, which places to put resources in, which bottlenecks are more important, right? So there's an essence, there's a magnet for magnets. You remove the magnet for the magnets themselves disperse over time. And then without any of that, you have your own magnet you put in for how you'd like to feel about certain things. And again, sometimes it's sort of instantaneous. You'll realize, oh, and you'll have like a certain kind of paradigm shift. And there's a reason why it's instantaneous. Basically, sometimes when you shift your just a perspective, doesn't even have to be foundational. Just sometimes you kind of shift an organizing principle, and everything else falls into place, like kind of the way your mind already, with what's already in your mind. It just, oh, okay. A simple example of this is someone cuts you off in a car, and when you're driving, and there's another car, and you're like, oh, what a jerk. But then you see who it is, and it's like someone that's been wonderful to you. And you're like, oh, okay, maybe they're just having a moment, or didn't see me, or something like that, or maybe they're kind of a little bit of a jerk in a certain way when they drive, but they're overall nice, right? So there was like a quick change where then it organized what was already in your mind, and then the rest of it falls into place. So an effect of what we're doing, or kind of the effect of foundationalism, will be to allow us to remove a magnet for magnets. Then when we put our own magnet in, I know I'm speaking in kind of metaphorical terms here, but we'll put our own magnet in for how we want to look at things and feel about things, and feel about what's correct and what's important and all that. And again, what you feel about what's important is kind of ends up being one and the same with what drives everything in your life. it's logically related to what you feel is true, right, and so forth, because it's like what you feel is true about what's good and important, or what's important about what's good, right? In other words, good is like logically related or kind of one and the same with goals that you have. So what you feel about your goals is the same as what you feel about is good. So you change that, and then right, you've changed what you feel about what's good. You change goals, and of course that's like steering the wheel, right? The goals steer everything going on with you. And then in terms of accomplishing goals, then or remember goals boil down to what you feel like is the main bottleneck anyway, as I talked about last webinar, right? Like there's really one overall goal, and the rest of it is just dealing with bottlenecks in the general sense of bottlenecks, obstacles, overcoming inertia, getting enough momentum, avoiding wrong paths. All those are what I mean by bottleneck in this series. So it's all driven, right? And it all relates. Foundationalism allows us to change things, to reprogram things, and so forth, which and foundationalism also is one and the same with realizing that reprogramming our minds doesn't really help until and unless we get beneath just reprogramming. Just being able to reprogram your goals doesn't do very much for you, because the goals themselves need to be, remember, goals end up being one of the same as bottlenecks, right? So it's all kind of goes right together. Goals are one of the same as bottlenecks. It doesn't help to program your mind with which bottleneck is most important until and unless you can actually correctly identify which is most important, right? So the programming matters, but programming your mind to have the right goals and the right dissatisfaction and all that stuff is what success gurus talk about in various ways, right? How to program your mind with external stuff, with not, positive thinking, with who you associate with, right? What you repeat to yourself, all sorts of stuff like that. That's all the kind of the standard advice. But it is meta strategy, but it's not foundational until and unless we realize that that is relatively unimportant, until we can first figure out what goals are actually going to help us. And that's one and the same with figuring out what the real bottlenecks are. You see, so it's weirdly profound and simple as this kind of all comes together. Kind of like a webinar is a microcosm of that, right? I kind of skip around, talk about things, or at least appear to skip around, right? Because these things are so related in my mind, and I think correctly so, that when I'm trying to explain them, then kind of it can look like some skipping around until they all kind of collapse to like an idea that kind of coalesces. But that may be happening, or at least on the replay, or the third replay or fourth replay, you might have the same sense. Now you might be noticing I haven't defined foundationalism, but I don't define things in the traditional sense of I give like a set of words that define a term. What I'm trying to do is construct a context that'll allow you to see and feel and understand it. In the case of foundationalism, we can have quick metaphors. The word itself is a kind of self-metaphorical, it's not self-fully explanatory, but right, the whole idea of foundation is that it's a familiar word, right? So defining it wouldn't do anything more than just reinforce the metaphor inside the word of having something firm and reliable that you're standing on. But in order to explain what I really mean, I need to do what I'm doing since the webinar began. A person who was even more able to explain this concisely might do so. However, I'm doing the best I can, but I'm not losing sight of the idea of trying. I'm directly going after explaining what foundationalism is here as best as I'm able to. So any inefficiency would be due to lack of talent and skill in explaining, but not lack of focus. I'm not losing focus on explaining directly what foundationalism is. Okay. I've covered the second sentence, which doesn't mean that I've explained it thoroughly or in a way that necessarily you got, but I covered it. And then the best way to continue to cover it is to continue. All other methods of controlling or escaping your mind, quote unquote, rob Peter to pay Paul, right? That saying means it's like credit card spending, or whatever, right? You're taking from one place to, you're taking resources from one place to put another place in a way that you're kind of not really getting ahead necessarily. And so what I mean by that is when you try to let's say use what might feel like willpower to do something, there's nothing wrong with trying willpower, just the same way there's nothing wrong with just trying to duplicate someone else's method of accomplishing some task, right? You're like, here's my recipe, and you try it. You do it to see how far that takes you, basically. But I don't know why I'm having trouble explaining this here. It made perfect sense when I typed this on the slide. And maybe you're getting a feeling from it that makes sense to you too. But just in case, like if we decide, oh, I just don't care what other people think. When you're trying to, just deal with, there's something come up in your life where you feel like you should do things a certain way. Other people are going to kind of not approve, and you're like, well, I don't care what they think. Well, if you don't properly get underneath that issue, then that's probably going to be a temporary solution. You probably will end up back around to caring what they think. It's sort of like any sort of mental struggle. You're probably going to fail at some point to win that struggle. In the absence of foundationalism, if you try to like write down your goals and figure out your priorities and put things around that kind of motivate you and and so forth, but as a substitute for getting underneath things, then that might work out, but it might not. Like anytime that you're not getting down to the foundation of things, you are risking that you're standing in the wrong place, and therefore you're just going to fail no matter what you do. Like trying to give an example, so I'm not just speaking in general terms. Like Mike in his email that he wrote today, give a cool anecdote about the audiovisual at the recent Monetizing Traffic Live event this past week. And what he did was have layers of redundancy with the audiovisual issue, and that worked. And that was the best we could do. You can't really, well, to get foundational with that, you would have to understand the audiovisual situation, including at that particular venue, right? Event location, basically perfectly. So you might say, well, David, you talk about foundationalism, but how am I supposed to do that? Well, you're not in that case, right? It's not realistic. And so in a case like that, by luck, you might just fail. Now, he had enough layers of redundancy that he didn't, and he needed those layers of redundancy, so it was great. And he has a great story about how now foundationalism in a certain way helped me identify, right, that if audio, like, and a foundational way of thinking about it is like if audio visual fails, then the event basically fails no matter what else is good. Like no matter how good all the rest, like the speakers might otherwise be, and etc., then the event kind of just fails, right? Like if you literally can't hear people, if they can't speak, if they can't, or if like Greg's presentation, if it couldn't be shown at all, then at least the event may not have been said to fail, of course, but that presentation would have fully failed. And if that happened with all of them, then of course that's just like a full fail, right? So in some situations in life that you can identify something, right? Like bottlenecks don't all types of bottlenecks don't occur in all situations, but one of the ones you look for, which is not the same thing as asking what's the worst that can happen. I've mentioned this from time to time, but that isn't really the type of question that I ask. What's the worst that can happen? I mean, you can ask it, and if it gives you something useful, great. But there's a way that asking the question isn't really, and it's never really what I'm implying you should do if it seems like it. Instead of what's the worst that can happen, you ask what are the bottlenecks, and then what are the one of the first things you look for is which of these potential issues could be a full failure condition, right? Another like a one that wasn't one that wouldn't, an example of something that wouldn't be a full failure condition, but was still a bottleneck that would be good to deal with, that Mike dealt with, is the speakers, right? Are you can and we did, which is a third type of bottleneck. We approach the event in a way where we put ourselves in a position to get really, really good speakers. Not so much, certainly they had plenty of stature and prestige and branding, but that of course is not how big someone's name is or how many followers they have or even how much money they allegedly make, or even maybe really make in some rare cases. Usually it's allegedly. That of course is not one-to-one corresponds to how good a speaker they're going to be, right? By how good a speaker, I mean what's the best positive impact they're going to have on the attendees, right? What speakers will lead that's how I would define a good speaker, right? Is one that's going to have the most impact. In other words, it's going to have the most impact on the bottlenecks that the attendees have, right? So you want to have good speakers, and looked at it that way, and we did look at it that way. We put ourselves in a position to do that by not being in a rush. It was the first and foremost way that we put ourselves in a position. Next is the bottleneck of, so there's the audio visual, and to contrast that with another bottleneck, but that wasn't a full failure condition. So it was in a certain sense secondary and important, but it was still critical. So there's plenty of cases where there's multiple bottlenecks that have to be dealt with, right, in order to have a success. And pretty much you want to smooth out everything, right, to ensure success. In a lot of cases in life, you cannot ensure success. The idea of foundationalism still helps us recognize that, right? When we're used to thinking in terms of foundationalism, then we also realize where we're not able to realistically be foundational. But that's useful. Foundationalism, you're still practicing foundationalism by being able to practicing foundationalism or understanding it, or having already had the paradigm shift to recognizing what foundationalism is and why it's in essence all important. A great benefit to that is that you recognize all sorts of areas in life where you cannot get fully foundational, right? With audiovisual, you can't understand every aspect of it realistically in this case. Both the general topic and then the venue and how that relates, and then you'd have to presumably then it could relate to the power grid itself of that city, right? And et cetera, et cetera. So realizing that there's a limit to it can be useful, because then you work that into your thinking and realize it's possible it'll fail outside of your control. And that's, again, somehow part of your understanding of the situation. Is good to go into it with that. May not come up that it matters to go into it with that, but it might in various ways. I can give other examples where going in knowing that you don't have full control over a situation can be very practically useful. But you can find examples of that yourself, presumably. So audiovisual full bottleneck. To contrast that, another thing that I talked about Mike with, and that he put a lot of time and effort and talent into, was that if you imagine you're a speaker at an event, right? So you're already as good as you are overall as a person who can have impact on the attendees. And you might have software that you developed, or you might have whatever knowledge you've built in your experience, and whatever character you have in terms of caring about the audience and such. So that's in our control as much as it is, right? It's not in our full control, because once again, we'd have to understand so much about the world and about each person and their character and what they understand about their topic, which presumably is way more than we ourselves understand, right, about any particular topic, right? What Myron Golden understands about sales and what he's going to say about it, and his presentation of it is way past what I would do if I was MC, right? He's just very talented and experienced with what he does, and it's way past my ability to do that specifically. Therefore, right, that in and of itself is a quick indication that how am I going to get foundational, where I understand his talk and his thing so well that I guarantee, right, I can't. So what can I do? Or what could Mike do in this case? And what he could do is bring the most out of people that he realistically could by being engaged, inspecting, not inspecting like a government health inspector, right? Or someone walking around with a white glove looking for dust, but being engaged with seeing what they're doing. Like if you're a speaker and the guy that's the kind of front man for the event, in this case Mike, is engaged with your presentation, is interested in seeing it and enthusiastic, and he'll read it, right, or look at the slides and give not feedback, but generally vibe with it, right? Not like even correcting it, right? Because it's not realistic. It doesn't, like the odds of that improving a presentation are kind of low by the time you risk pissing somebody off and being condescending, or plus again, the level of expertise that I or Mike might have relative to the level of expertise of the presenter themselves about exactly what they're presenting about. The whole point of them presenting is that they have a high level of expertise and experience, and even focus and attention on that particular topic, right, and the presentation itself. But by being engaged and inspecting in a useful way, very useful way, then the speaker is going to do what? It's going to feel a heightened sense of importance, maybe a very significant heightened sense of importance. It's one of the things Mike's very good at, is engaging with a person in a way that heightens the sense of importance of what Mike is engaging with them about. He's just extremely talented and energetic and so forth about that. It's kind of naturally where his energy goes, and a place where he has a natural talent. So I had enough understanding to know that Mike has a natural talent for that, and then he did that with his talent and energy, and it was very effective. So that was an example of a bottleneck, and that my expansive use of the term bottleneck, where that gave more, let's say, momentum, right, to the speakers and their presentation, but not a full thing like the audiovisual. Anyway, that's kind of a useful example of taking a look at bottlenecks. And what did I do for the event, right, was bring my overall way of looking at things with bottlenecks to it, where I was able to, in essence, correctly and cleverly and with talent identify the bottlenecks and assign kind of resources to those. So just an example of like how I do things and what I mean by what I'm teaching. Okay. And then I wrote not foundational. And this has to do with burden of proof. Right? I'm not trivializing, you know, the double negative here or whatever. I'm not just being kind of flippant with words or language. If you don't know that something is foundational, then it's not foundational. And maybe it is, but then discover it. Right? How do you get to correct knowledge of things? Knowing. Well, your mind is made to, oh my gosh, I know what I interrupted was a really good example that I started to tell you about what I talked about with my wife. So I'll kind of close with that, and then we'll continue in my next recording with continuing to talk about foundationalism. Part of really getting this paradigm shift to foundationalism is maybe the crux of it is to distinguish between how your mind is all geared around creating a sense of clarity and certainty that's fabricated. And again, I'll get into that good example and mental exercise or mental image and explanation I have of that next. It's kind of the final thing for this webinar. So the shift is when we become so familiar and respect how our mind does this and appreciate it, but we don't buy into the clarity as foundational. It's a little bit like if someone is adjusting a projector, like a slide projector, and you know how you can adjust it to get it, you know, focused on the screen where it's clear. And if you turn the knob in either direction, it's less clear. When it's let's say someone's turning the knob and you're looking, this isn't the example that I have, I'll get to my other example that I share with my wife in a moment. But they're sliding the slide projector back and forth and you're like, no, that's not clear, that's not clear. Okay, that's clear, now it's clear, it's in focus. Like the image on the slide, on the project, on the what is it called? On the wall. The screen on the wall. You want to be able to appreciate seeing something clearly on a slide, on the wall, on the screen, without thinking that you see every pixel, is one angle on how to explain things. So you can appreciate a sense of clarity from your mind. You can appreciate a sense of certainty. Sometimes you might not appreciate a sense of certainty. You might kind of just flat out deny it. But one way or the other, you can take it for what it is. You want to be able to extract the usefulness of what your mind gives you but break out of confusing a sense of certainty that your mind gives you with foundationalism. And I said that last phrase, confusing it with foundationalism, as part of explaining foundationalism, not with the assumption that I've already explained foundationalism and I'm telling you not to confuse your mind's fabricated certainty with something I've already explained and that you already understand called foundationalism. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we want to stop confusing our mind's sense of certainty that it gives us, fabricated certainty, with foundationalism. I'm saying that phrase as part of explaining foundationalism. So I'm saying that as part of filling in the picture of what I mean by foundationalism. All right, so now I'll go over the kind of mental image. So let's think about the visual information that's coming into our mind. And imagine you're your mind now, your brain, and you're trying to give something to you, right, as a conscious being or whatever. And that's your dilemma. So what's coming into you as your brain and mind, including your eyes and visual system? Well, there's basically light waves our photons and such are hitting retina, right, and being transmitted to neural impulses. So there's basically this kind of somewhat chaotic data, right? We can think of it in terms of light waves, photons, neural impulses. Wherever we kind of draw the line or say that's what's coming into the brain, that starts to be eye-opening, so to speak. No pun or whatever intended. But our mind has to take that data, that raw data, and what do we get? We get this conscious experience. Like if you look around the room that you're in right now, or wherever you're in, if you're outside, and you might see a chair or a computer or a phone, and it's pretty clear, right? Like you don't feel like there's just a whole bunch of light waves coming in or chaotic information. You feel like, wow, there's a crisp, relatively crisp, is like, depending on the state of your eyesight and your glasses and so forth. But like this kind of crisp image, distinct of your phone, of whatever else, maybe chair, maybe trees if you're outside, exercise equipment if you're listening while you're exercising. Including, not only do you get the crisp and clear edges to various objects, but the very sense that it's an object in the first place. Remember, your mind is not necessarily receiving objects as information, right? It's receiving like electrical impulses, right? Or light waves, where again, wherever you kind of draw the line, right? So those light waves are just like this kind of, it's not fully chaotic, of course, but relatively chaotic light waves. There's no object there inherently in a certain way of looking at it, right? There could be an object externally in a certain way. There could be an object in the intent in the mind of God. If you're looking at a computer screen and of a world, then there can be objects in the mind of the inbuilt in the algorithm, the computer code, like can literally have an object labeled as such. And the computer programmer for the code could have had an object in mind, of course, right? If there's like if you're playing like a golf game on the computer, right? Then there's a person presumably that you are with a golf club, and so the golf club is like an object that you as the person, and there might be an object. There might be a green inside the world of the computer, right? And a putting green and a rough and whatever, right? A golf ball. Those are all objects. Those objects exist in the computer code. They exist in the mind of the programmer. They exist in your mind as the viewer or the player of the game. But to your computer, well, they're labeled as such as objects, but there's also just these ones and zeros, right, that are being encoded ultimately. And those get translated, right, into objects and so forth. So your mind is taking this data, right? The equivalent of ones and zeros or electrical impulses or whatever. And ones and zeros might not exactly translate in the mind, right? It might not be exactly a 1 and 0 situation, but metaphorically speaking, at least. And it's making this clarity and this you see, you don't just see the border and the image that would be a tree. You get a feeling and a thought that it is a tree. You get a certainty that it's a tree or your mobile phone, right? So you feel certain that it is a mobile phone, that there's a mobile phone out there, that your hand exists physically. There's a world that it exists in that's real. Right? All of these thoughts and certainties come into your awareness, or the kind of implication of them comes into your awareness. You might not be aware, some of these things I'm pointing out are kind of implicit, right? That there's a real world out there, or that your hand is real, and that it's holding the phone. You might not have all these thoughts like front and center in your mind simultaneously, but they're all there, or they're in the immediate context of being there. And your mind does that for you. You see how it fabricates this certainty? And a lot of what it fabricates is very useful and sort of necessary. So you want to appreciate that. But your mind is also going to fabricate certainty for things like, let's say you haven't accomplished that much for the last couple of days. for whatever reasons, then your mind is going to extrapolate. And boy, is extrapolation a major concept that we want to, I don't know how long it might be quick to get into it when we get into it in the future, but not buying into your mind's extrapolation, right? Because your mind's physical representation of the world and visual representation is for practical application, it's constantly useful and functionally accurate. Functionable is not a real word, but it's kind of a funny word that someone coined one day. That's kind of a little bit of a joke in my mind. I don't think it's a real word. Anyway, it's very functional. Should be a word, right? So when we use when I talk about your mind fabricating things and I talk about visual, it's easy to follow what I'm saying and kind of see what your mind does. But you might think, well, that's really useful, David. Why do I need to not? What am I supposed to do? Not see what I'm seeing or not be certain of it? In the case of visual and physical stuff, there's times when you might want to look at it differently, but not very much in your practical life. Maybe when you're thinking about origins and God and fundamentally how the world works, then you need to revisit that and be able to think about it differently, and that will be necessary. And then that will have what you can come to from that will have then ripple effects in your daily life. But day by day, you don't need to override or not rubber stamp your mind's sense of certainties with your visual, physical sense of the world. But with extrapolation, you're going to want to constantly not buy into it because it's so constantly wrong when your mind extrapolates. And extrapolating, an example, is when you haven't accomplished something for a couple of days, and then you start to feel really overwhelmed and maybe a little depressed or whatever. Because what your mind does is think, well, you haven't accomplished something for the last several hours or a couple of days, or you haven't, it might not be that you've accomplished nothing, but you haven't moved forward on a goal that feels important in some sense to your mind. And then you just start to feel overwhelmed, right? Or maybe you're in school and you have a report to do and you haven't worked on that particular report. You've been procrastinating, or in your business, there's something that you kind of feel like you need to do, but you haven't moved forward on that particular thing for a couple of days. And then you start to feel overwhelmed and kind of weak, right, in various ways and so forth. That's purely an artifact of the way that your mind extrapolates. And as you come to realize how your mind does that, you can just really not buy into it in the same way. Similarly, I've mentioned this before fairly recently in webinars, but possibly not though in this. I don't think I did it in the last webinar, but I might have. So if it's repeating, that's fine. Similarly, you can feel a sense of euphoria and kind of superhumanness if you've accomplished a lot recently, and even if you just drank some coffee and you have a lot of physical energy, and you can commit to too much and promise too much, or just promise too much to yourself and what you're going to do the next day, and then lead to kind of a boom bust type cycle, or just set yourself up to kind of break promises or disappoint people, right? So in either case, the extrapolation can get you. And so getting used to seeing that and how often that's wrong in so many ways. With money, right? People, boy, they blow through their money so easily this way. Or they're overly stingy at times they don't need to be, right? Just based on the recent past. Or we judge our relationship partners of any type of relationship based on their very recent behavior, positive, negative, efficient, inefficient, they did a lot of work, they didn't do a lot of work. And so fast we'll judge this, our mind will come up with a trend and, oh, this person isn't like this or that, or, oh, things aren't as good as they used to be, or whatever. Super fast. Way too, and it's constantly off. And you can save yourself so much grief in so many ways. And save yourself from causing like dings or major cuts in relationships, business, personal, whatever, by not buying into extrapolation, for example. And that's a major like mind trap, so to speak, that we can get out of with foundationalism. And so I'll kind of wrap up with this idea, which is that, again, this will be familiar to people that have followed me for a while, but you break out of any mind trap by doing the following, but you can do the following much better, or it's maybe not even possible to do what I'm about to say really, unless you kind of get the paradigm shift of foundationalism. But you can call down your mind, so to speak, kind of like calling your mind's bluff, anytime of the certainty bluff. Anytime you want, by just saying, well, what's the reason? And then what's the reason for the reason? And what's the reason for the reason? And your mind's just going to be like, at a certain point. But before it goes, it's going to do what other people are going to do to you. You're going to kind of do to yourself, or your mind's going to do to you, depending how you look at your mind. But what will other people do if you start asking for the reason, is they will change the subject, get annoyed, get bored, walk away, have an appointment, have to stop getting out of the conversation, get exhausted, right? Whatever, get a headache. But all the defenses will kick in to change the topic, to rebel, whatever, to get tired, to have an appointment, right? Something else is more important to talk about. So something else will come up to feel like very important. Your mind will try to change the subject. The more you absorb foundationalism, the more you'll get rid of the magnets that cause this. They'll degrade. It'll integrate and become more of an easy thing for your mind to break out of these traps. So your mind can't change the subject or get exhausted or whatever. But basically, your mind's going to do to you at first, and for maybe a while, who knows, the same thing other people will do if you try to call them down on their lack of foundations for what they believe, or their actions, or what they believe about what's important, or whatever, what their goals are, or whatever the heck, what they believe about you, or just a trend. If they're like, hey, you're not doing this lately, or whatever. And they're extrapolating, and you're trying to, now you might be able to point out how they're extrapolating. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Or you can kind of get used to a quick sales pitch, which is useful to have in life for when people are extrapolating, again, in a way that's not about you. That's just based on just like the last couple of days. Maybe you just didn't have time for them the last couple of days, but it doesn't like mean that you generally don't have time for them, or you like them less, or whatever. And so having like kind of a way to deal with that without explaining, doing this whole webinar for them, is good. Just say, oh no, it's the last couple of days. I get how that makes sense, that you would feel that way. I see how it appears that way. I might feel that way too, right? Feel, felt, found, or whatever. You kind of validate their feeling about their extrapolation that they're doing way too fast. But you can say it's not a trend. I don't mean it's a trend, and it's just last couple of days, but I don't, that isn't how I feel, or what I mean to be doing. Or you can preempt it. They might not say anything, but you can just guess that after like 2 days of something, people are gonna feel like that's how it's been your whole life, and that's how you are, or that's how things are from now on, or how the whole future is going to be. This is just nonstop. People's minds do this, right? Your mind, other people's minds. And so preempting it by saying, I know I haven't been available the last couple of days, or it hasn't looked like I've been working on a lot, but I've been, working on this project. If it's a business partner, you want to make sure that they know that you're working on stuff, right? If there's been nothing visible to them for a couple of days, then you might want to say something. So that there's that. Okay. I will wrap things up here more for the sake of time than because it's any kind of perfect endpoint. And we'll continue with foundationalism, but however we get to this shift, and however you get to understand it, I always feel like when I'm talking about this stuff, there's a theoretical way to do a better job, or the perfect presentation. But I also feel like this webinar's gone just fine. And a perfect editor, or if I had the whole transcript and could edit it and work on it for a while, we could get it down in by 15 minutes or half an hour or whatever. But ultimately, this is the bang per buck on getting this is so massive, right? That perfect efficiency with a webinar is kind of pales in comparison to what you're going to get for getting this. So to whatever extent that your mind might wander, or it might be hard to follow, or absorb it all from one webinar, then just watch it a couple times, work on it a bit with yourself with a paper notebook and pen is great. And the benefits of getting this are just everything, right? So a few hours or several hours or any number of hours. How's your mind supposed to guess in advance what this foundationalism paradigm shift is going to be worth? I mean, it has literally no way to guess. And yet it's, so if it gives you any sort of time limit or sense of this is worth 2 hours, 1 hour, 10 minutes, 100 hours, then it's totally guessing with no basis or foundation for it. And it particularly just has no even real basis for making an educated guess. So this is worth everything to get this topic of foundationalism. It flows logically. It's completely related and kind of logically one and the same ultimately with breaking bottlenecks, because to break bottlenecks, we need to have contextual understanding of the situation to identify bottlenecks properly and what to do about them. And then once we start looking at contextual understanding, which is meta strategy, we should realize not to stop with context. Because think about it, you're arbitrarily stopping just based on the lack of time or just a sense of something else now feels more important or whatever. When you're looking at context, there's kind of always more context, right? Until you get to full clarity. It's reasonable and necessary with that, in various ways to, you can only give a certain amount of resources and focus and time to various goals and so forth. But overall in life, taking life as a whole, strategy as a whole, we must get to the bottom of things. And it's not that hard, at least doesn't seem to me to be. What doesn't matter how hard, but especially once I say it, what are the things that like really we need to get to the bottom of? What are things that are going to be really related or so close to what's foundational? What our mind, goals. I mean, I have this slide here. Here, I'll just put this here. Knowing, like, how do I know if something's true? Who am I? What's my basic identity? How does that relate to my mind? Am I my mind? If not, how does that relate, right? What's my power? What's my free will? Like, what is it? There's got to be something. If you have any power, I've gone into this at length in the past. If you have any power at all, any free will at all, then it is what it is, right? There's some power. If you identify it, that's great. You figure out what it is, right? Instead of just having your mind determine, oh, on my body, I can affect this. Your sense of power that your mind fabricates for you is not that accurate. And neither is the sense of getting power from like believing that yourself is always doing things right and is awesome or whatever. That's not the way to increase your power, is just to believe in yourself more. There's a different way and a better way. So understanding your power, what it is, and it isn't unlimited. Although over time, I guess there's a way that it is kind of unlimited in terms of time, but like it's unlimited in the sense that we can achieve our goal of getting things, optimal goodness for everybody. Not by creating a utopia on Earth, but through understanding that idea more and more. So we can keep understanding it better and better. And it doesn't matter what the state is exactly of or what we can achieve in terms of goodness, because there's plenty that clearly can be achieved now. Like there's plenty of bottlenecks that we can break in terms of people having a better quality of life, quality of existence, right? Conscious experience now and in the future. Clearly, there's realistic things that can be done for that. It's not optimized right now. It's nowhere near. So there's plenty of low-hanging fruit. So let's deal with that first, and then we'll worry about how far we can get. There's power, goals, right? Just the concept of goals. This is a topic that I worked on. I spent so many hundreds or thousands of hours on this topic trying to figure it out. And I've gotten so far. Like I have such clarity. There might be more clarity to get to, but knowledge, identity, power, the nature of goals, how they interact with us, our mind, our quality of life, other people, and then we understand other people better by we understand the nature of goals and our mind, right? It's all right there at the core. So trying to understand these topics, these ideas, the nature of these things better is just pretty obviously going to help us and impact. And I can testify to you, it's going to have a terrific impact on your day-to-day life, the quality of your life, and your impact on the quality of other people's lives. Massive impact. Your bang per buck on focus on this and spending time is going to be massive. Another thing I wrote here on the slide as I close up. One of the very close to foundational concepts, or maybe foundational concept, is getting time on your side. Your effectiveness and your happiness is going to be very related to your sense of whether overall in your existence and your life and so forth, is time working for you or against? Doesn't even matter to part of understanding that might be understanding time, but even a rudimentary understanding of time, or a simple or normal understanding of time. Getting time on your side is going to both getting it on your side and understanding the nature of this idea, understanding the nature of whether overall in our existence is time on our side or not. So kind of philosophically having time on your side, and then in practice getting it on your side in various ways, is going to terrifically impact your efficiency, your effectiveness, your strategy, your planning, and your happiness. In a sense, your happiness is almost one for one with how much your mind kind of calculates. Like the kind of sense of well-being that your mind is going to give you is going to flow from your mind's calculation about whether time is on your side. That's not one and the same with whether time is on your side or not. But one way to ensure that your mind is constantly calculating is to figure out what's true about time being on your side, get to it, and having your mind, like kind of communicating it to your mind, having clarity where there's not something, your mind's going to have the correct ideas if something's not blocking your mind from having correct ideas. Right. So the better you understand something, the better it'll get integrated in your mind, and so forth. And this I won't get into, but the meaning of the word, or the implied all, is something I want to get to at some point. I'm kind of excited about it, really communicating this at some point. It's a major concept, but I'm not going to get into it right now. Okay. Comments for the time being are kind of more for you guys than for me to interact with, just because the length and the nature of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to wrap this up. I actually won't even switch over to them. Maybe I switch over, just people are saying. But you're very welcome, Kim, for the information. So much gold. I'm glad, Fletch. Great. Definitely blow money on extrapolation. Oh, cool. That's great that you noticed that. Good. And so we can see how that getting this idea of extrapolation alone will, give you a massive bang for your buck, right? On the few hours it might take for you to kind of get that in conjunction with me, kind of listening to me talk about it, and then working on it on your own, is just so practical and nonstop with how that works. Okay, guys, I will, using our magic weapon, you're welcome, Denicia. Thanks for everyone that came on live, a whole bunch of people. And I will see you guys soon. So I don't know if I explained this on the recording. I'm probably, based on what I've experienced this last couple of weeks, I'm probably kind of getting a feel for things. I'm probably gonna move this series to recordings that I do, and then I know that next week will be part of the Heroes series of Dave Mazzaros. Come on, that'll be awesome, and I appreciate that with Dave. And then in 2 weeks after that, I'm leaning towards maybe doing just a discussion with people, discussion Q&A, that sort of thing. So, and because what I ran into with this webinar was I started developing this concept. I might have done it as a recording, but then I wanted to have something to talk about live and didn't want to be rushed with that, where I had to have a limited amount of time to come up with another thing for the next one. So I kind of delayed things to make it the live topic. And I kind of want to be able to record this series when I'm kind of most ready to, rather than having it have to overlap with the live timing. And that way I can be most sharp, at the time of day and so forth. So that's what I think I'll try next and see how that works out. And then it's very possible that I'll do, more of this in a live webinar at some point with the series, but we'll do that for now. It'll be pretty much every 2 weeks for now, unless otherwise noted. But I'll try to give you, I'm going to look to give you a good amount of advance notice. I'll say goodbye to people watching the recording. I'll stop actually, I don't know how if I stop the recording, I don't know how well that'll work. Sometimes GoToWebinar kind of messes that up. So I won't. Anyway, you should assume for now that there will be a webinar at 4 p.m. Eastern on Sunday, regardless of when I post. I mean, I'll try to give people days in advance warning, but regardless, you can kind of bank on it, and I'll particularly give advance notice if it'll deviate from that, right? So if it's going to be the same as that, I may or may not, give a ton of days of notice with a link. But if I deviate, I'll try to tell you as soon as possible, even a week or more in advance if possible. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. Love it. And I will be with you more and continue with the series and continue with everything. So until next time.